But thank you, Chairman Peters and Ranking Member Fisher, for inviting me to discuss the challenges facing America's supply chain and freight network. The employees represented by TTD's 33 affiliated unions are on the front lines of these challenges, including workers directly engaged in the freight transportation at railroads, ports, and in trucking, as well as those who work in industries like manufacturing that are grappling with the rippling effects of supply chain choke points and delays. Ultimately, there is no lone actor, decision, or policy that is responsible for this situation. However, we must acknowledge the long-term structural issues going back 40 years that must be addressed so that we do not find ourselves in this same place when the next crisis occurs. The historic rise in cargo volume has stressed every component of the freight transportation network, frequently to the breaking point. And this includes workers, many of whom have been pushed past the brink of exhaustion. I must be perfectly clear on one point. Workers are not the cause of this crisis, but they are working around the clock to fix it. Putting any amount of blame for this crisis on the shoulders of hardworking Americans who drive our economy through thick and thin is unacceptable. This is particularly true when such scapegoating is done as an excuse to undermine collective bargaining rights or further deteriorate their safety or working conditions. Instead, let's acknowledge that short-sighted industry practices and decades-long underinvestment in supply chain infrastructure have rendered our supply chain incapable of meeting the current soaring demand for goods. Unfortunately, while the drastic spike in demand was unpredictable, the results were in many ways inevitable. For example, the lack of elasticity among freight railroads has worsened the supply chain challenges. For years, Class I railroads have pursued an operating model known as Precision Scheduled Railroading, or PSR. Through the PSR model, the railroads all but ensured that their operations would not be able to rapidly respond to economic shocks or rapid changes in the flow of traffic like those we are now seeing. The real-world impact of the freight railroad's business model is that they slashed a staggering 20% of their workforce in the 5 years prior to the pandemic. When greater and more reliable freight service was obviously needed, the railroads only dug in further to their skeleton crew operations and continually prioritized profits over people. Some claim a shortage of employees in the supply chain as a major factor in this crisis. Such claims imply that the workers needed to perform a job do not exist in our current market. This is simply not true. The truth is that many employers fail to provide the incentives, including good wages, working conditions, and benefits that will attract and retain skilled workers. In the trucking industry, for example, blatant worker misclassifications artificially suppressed wages and made working conditions untenable. This is also true in rail, where our unions report mid-career employees walking away from formerly good jobs and secure retirements due to eroding workplace conditions. We are unequivocal. PSR and other industry practices have resulted in a network that was less prepared for this crisis. There are no overnight fixes to our supply chain challenges. When the scope of disruptions became clear, the administration established a whole-of-government response that paved the way for nimble and integrated collaboration and planning. The Biden administration's decisive actions are already yielding positive results. Just since the beginning of November, we've seen a 41% reduction in containers sitting on our docks for over 9 days. While there have been misleading, if not outright falsified claims of empty store shelves, the on-shelf availability of goods at grocery and drugstores has, in fact, effectively returned to pre-pandemic levels. Ocean shipping costs remain high, but they are now showing signs of meaningful decrease. Decisive and focused actions have made a difference here. Policymakers, including those in Congress, must, however, address the systemic problems that put us in this situation in the first place. In doing so, we call on you to work closely with supply chain employees and their union representatives across the nation to develop real, long-term solutions. Congress and economic regulators must consider and address the impacts that drastic reduction in the rail workforce and degradation in service quality have had on supply chain disruptions, let alone whether current railroad operations are consistent with our statutory common carrier obligations. I would like to thank Senator Baldwin for introducing an amendment to the NDAA, which would give the Surface Transportation Board more tools and authority to address bad behavior by the railroads. Solutions must also include robust and well-directed investments in our nation's freight infrastructure. To that end, we strongly applaud the enactment of the IIJA, the Infrastructure Act, which provides $2.2 billion for the Port Infrastructure Development Program, offering a lifeline to the almost half of all U.S. ports who state that better rail access could increase their throughput capacity by over 25%. Historic investments in the rail network and in multimodal development will similarly act to prevent or blunt future supply chain challenges. Congress should also consider novel approaches to supply chain challenges that would create jobs and economic activity. For example, the expansion of waterborne transportation alternatives through our marine highways may ease supply chain bottleneck, particularly at major ports. And finally, we once again call on you to reject ill-conceived efforts to manipulate the crisis to attack workers themselves. The pursuit of a more efficient supply chain cannot be an excuse to eliminate regulatory safeguards or attack collective bargaining rights. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.